Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, is a U.S. war in Venezuela imminent?
Nicolas Maduro told thousands of his supporters that U.S. deployments to the region have been testing his country.
What's really behind the U.S. military buildup off the coast of Venezuela? And what are the consequences for the millions of Venezuelans living through this crisis? I'm Manuel Rapalo, and this is The Take. Before we continue with today's show, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode and what stories you want us to do next. Or on your podcast app, leave us a review telling us where you're listening from and give us a 5-star rating while you're there. It helps the show.
My name is Alejandro Velasco, and I am Associate Professor of History at New York University.
Alejandro, welcome to The Take. The U.S. is intensifying pressure against Venezuela in the Caribbean, both in rhetoric and in military presence.
For 3 months, the U.S. military has carried out deadly strikes in the Caribbean Sea, targeting alleged drug trafficking vessels and killing more than 80 people.
In a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, U.S. President Donald Trump had this to say.
I want those boats taken out, and if we have to, we'll attack on land also, just like we attack on sea.
Why does it look like the U.S. is on the verge of going to war with Venezuela?
Well, there's lots of reasons. Some of them are more ideological. Some of them are more domestic in nature. What's interesting about this moment is that they're not new in terms of why the United States is at heightened tensions with Venezuela, but because they are conflating interests that are really manifesting at this moment, it feels all the more fraught. In fact, it's the most significant U.S. presence in the Caribbean militarily outside of planned exercises in the 21st century, and there's very few parallels that we have in the 20th century. There's lots in Venezuela that speaks to a U.S. audience that would be favorable to some kind of intervention. Obviously, there's the question of democracy. There's also the question of narcotics. But what's happened in this particular moment is that none of those explanations in any way fit the extent of the narrative that the United States government has really levied.
Let's focus in on that real quick. Trump justifies the military buildup, calling Venezuela a hub for narco-terrorism, calling Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro a cartel leader. But the reality is that Venezuela does not produce drugs at the scale that President Trump is suggesting. Most of the drugs are really just passing through from other Latin American countries, namely Colombia, where a majority of the world's cocaine is produced. What do you make of Trump targeting Maduro in this way, and what does it say about the Trump administration's broader goals in the country?
I think it's important to highlight that even though we might think of the Trump administration as united, it is not, in fact. There's lots of competing interests at play. And so to your question, the reason why there's this emphasis on narco-terrorism is because it's a discourse that plays much more favorably, especially among Trump's base, than would, say, regime change or democracy promotion. Those are aims or goals that the Republican base and certainly the Trump Make America Great Again base has rejected time and again.
This isn't the only contradiction, right, that we're seeing from the White House, but you have on the one hand, President Trump calling Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela a leader of a cartel. And then on the other hand, Trump just recently pardoned former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted and sentenced here in the United States on drug trafficking charges, accused of helping to facilitate hundreds of tons of cocaine from South America into the United States.
I think trying to find principled coherence in U.S. foreign policy is, history has taught us, much more of a fool's errand than a fruitful exercise. And so if we're not trying to find principle, then I think the question that we need to find is, well, what are the material interests that are at stake? And so, yes, there are these contradictions. And what it really highlights is the extent to which the Trump administration, I think Trump in particular, understands that his base is more than likely going to go along with almost anything that he says. Like they're not seeking some kind of, coherence or consistency. What they're seeking is results, right? And so thinking in terms of results, this is in part why we have this tension right now in terms of next steps vis-a-vis Venezuela. Trump's interest in resolving the Venezuela situation has to be around a simple, executable strategy that achieves regime change in favor of getting especially Venezuela's vast reserves of oil at very favorable rates.
Let's talk about the officials in the White House who are driving U.S. policy toward Venezuela. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. Rubio is now one of the most influential voices on Latin America inside the White House. Some analysts have compared his sort of influence to that of Henry Kissinger. Then you also have Pete Hegseth, on the other hand, who is facing serious questions over recent military actions against alleged Venezuelan drug boats. What do the priorities of these two men tell us about how the Trump administration views the region?
Yeah. So Pete Hegseth in particular, we have seen, certainly since he became Secretary of Defense and now Secretary of War, his approach and his interest in Venezuela is primarily instrumental. What he wants to do is to flex the muscular presence of the U.S. military in ways that he feels has not been done in the past. He wants to, as he said, free the U.S. military, U.S. warriors to engage in terms that they see fit to enact their objectives. And he sees in Venezuela a very viable place to do that. Of course, he's running up against precisely this animosity long stated on behalf of his boss, President Trump, that he doesn't want to engage in wars. And so they're trying to work on the margins, talking about terrorism, talking about narcotics, and then framing it as a military operation. But as we were seeing with the scandal that's embroiling him, it's not turning out as easily as he imagined. So that's Pete Hegseth's agenda. For Rubio, is primarily around an ideological project of regime change. He has long maintained that communism, given his Cuban-American background and his base in South Florida, is a stain on the region. And he very much sees not only the Venezuelan government, but the Nicaraguan government and others in the region as bastions of communism, although no one who supports communism would understand in those terms. And so for him, it's really a project of regime change in order to showcase that the United States will not allow certain types of ideologies to inhabit the Western Hemisphere, right? But again, Donald Trump does not care about ideology. Donald Trump cares about material interests. And so again, he has to sell him on something different. And it seems like that difference is around oil, right? And then increasingly we're hearing Donald Trump and others really highlight the extent to which Venezuela's vast oil reserves are the real payout here. They're the reason why we would, in the end, have any kind of intervention in Venezuela.
Let's stay on the topic of U.S. interests, because any discussion of current U.S.-Venezuela tensions inevitably sits within the longer history of U.S. intervention in Latin America. We can point to Chile, Guatemala, Ecuador, Panama, the list goes on. A lot of people are understandably viewing this sort of latest phase of aggressive action by the United States as possibly a new era of intervention. Maduro said,
"We do not want a slave's peace, nor the peace of colonies. Colony? Never. Slaves? Never."
What is unique about this current moment of U.S.-Venezuela relations, and what seems to follow the pattern of U.S. policy historically?
Yeah. Well, the most unique feature of what we're seeing right now is the scale of the military presence. As I was mentioning before, in the region, we have not seen this level of troop deployment, this level of military material deployment in the 21st century. And there's very few parallels in the 20th century even that we could point to. So, part of what seems extremely unique is just how robust the military presence is. And it really highlights the extent to which this Monroe Doctrine, not even 2.0, at this point it might be 16.0 or something along those lines, it really has as its primary function, military intervention, which is different from what we've seen in past interventions. They're more covert, or even when they're not covert, they're much more limited in scope. The CIA has mostly taken the lead in these kind of interventions rather than the U.S. Army itself, right? And so that's very particular to this moment. But there are, of course, patterns. And the biggest pattern is the idea that, in fact, the Western Hemisphere is the United States terrain. Latin America is its backyard. And ultimately, the rules of war, the international geopolitical precedents don't really matter as long as we keep the peace in the hemisphere along the lines that best benefits the United States. The common thread here is this hegemonic presence of the United States in the region asserting itself in ways that, because of the military presence, are much more brazen and much more robust than we've seen in the past.
More with Alejandro after the break. So, Alejandro, we've established that the U.S. now has a significant military presence in the Eastern Caribbean. At the same time, Venezuela's armed forces are on high alert. They have been conducting highly publicized military exercises. Yet publicly, President Nicolás Maduro appears almost carefree. At least that's the image that he's trying to portray. He's even been on camera dancing and singing. What do we know about the mood, however, within Maduro's inner circle?
We know very little. It's a very hermetic circle. It's largely, especially in the innermost circle, comprised of high-level military officials and Cuban intelligence officials. That's long been established. So there's not much that comes out of there other than what we see in public. But what we see in public is significant. We've not seen any indication at all of any kind of splintering, of any kind of weakening of the bonds that keep the upper echelons together. And why would we? Many of them, Maduro included, have international criminal court proceedings hanging over their heads. There are very few incentives for the upper echelons of the Madurista government to splinter. For them, it really is an existential battle to stay in power or to end up either in jail or worse. Right now, what we are seeing, however, is an understanding that in any kind of conventional conflict, Venezuela would not stand a chance. So what we're seeing is a kind of public demonstration of shows of internal force, primarily designed to highlight that the military is united. But really the plans underway are for a much more drawn out, guerrilla-type campaign that would sow chaos and confusion in order, again, to belie the idea that this could be an easy regime change operation in Venezuela.
Let's focus on that a little bit, of what that would look like. Because as carefree as Maduro may be appearing, we know that this is a very tense moment in the country. I want to point to some reporting done by the Reuters news agency that reported that Trump and Maduro had a phone call last weekend where Trump offered the Venezuelan president safe passage out of Venezuela. And Maduro replied with a counteroffer saying that he'd take it as long as he and his family had full legal amnesty and sanctions were removed from more than 100 Venezuelan government officials. Trump reportedly denied this request and told Maduro that he had 1 week to get out. So let's consider these possibilities. Let's talk about these scenarios. What would it mean for the people of Venezuela to have regime change?
It's a fantastic question, and one, of course, that is extremely difficult to answer. I think that the major way to approach that question is to say that the manner in which the regime changes, if it does, will significantly dictate what the next day and the day after that looks like after the regime has changed. If it is a regime change operation that comes as a result of a military intervention or a military operation, then I would say that the prospects for a lingering or long-lasting, stable, peaceful transition are extremely limited. And that's in part because those who would come into power, which is primarily not the local, but really the expatriated opposition in Venezuela, would have a really hard time, number one, trying to bring sectors of Chavismo, either both those in the that control the bureaucracy, but other those that continue to support what was a Chavista project, would have extreme trouble trying to bring them in line. And so the only real way to do that will be through repression or through the deployment of the military. There's also, of course, the issue of what happens with the military. Again, if it's a military intervention, then you'd have to basically wipe out the Venezuelan military, which would be, a difficult process, such as we've seen in many other interventions in the region. If, on the other hand, there is regime change that happens in a more negotiated fashion, and I realize for those who may be listening, that the idea of negotiations might be dead on arrival, but it's not in fact the case. I think that's largely kind of propaganda operation that many in the more extreme sectors of the opposition have sold. There are viable paths towards more negotiated transitions, which my understanding is also something that other Venezuelan officials have discussed with counterparties in the United States government. And so, if there was a transition that came about through negotiations rather than through intervention, then the prospects are much higher for a more stable, not peaceful necessarily, but a more fruitful, stable transition that would take longer time, but would hopefully bring to Venezuelans greater clarity about their future rather than what we have now, which is quite literally a Damocles sword hanging over their head in the form of military personnel stationed right off the shores of the country.
Can you talk a little bit about that scenario more? Because it does seem like the more best case scenario, you could argue, the more peaceful potential outcome, this idea of a peaceful transition into something new, something more democratic for Venezuela right now. One of the most prominent opposition figures is Maria Corina Machado. She recently was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, also later dedicated that prize to President Donald Trump. How does Machado fit into this equation?
She is by far the most visible current leader of the opposition. What we have seen in terms of opposition politics in Venezuela over the last 25 years, and Maria Corina Machado in particular, is that she's very shifty. She has oscillated between supporting democratic moves and supporting anti-democratic moves to oust first Chavez and then Maduro. And so within the larger population, she is very much seen as an extremist figure. And what she has been articulating over the past few weeks has really cemented that position. She has openly called for armed intervention in her country. She has openly stated that if there is regime change, she would gladly give up Venezuela's oil to U.S. companies, that she would privatize most of Venezuela's industrial park and into U.S. hands. And so, these have really highlighted the extent to which, an opposition government that's led by Maria Corina Machado would have a really hard time being inclusive, especially given what the experience has been over the last 25 years in Venezuela, which is expectations of greater inclusion, especially of popular sectors who had long been left out of Venezuela's political and economic system. That's what Chavez promised and for some time delivered, right? And so if the idea is that we're going back to a pre-Chavez era, then unsurprisingly, what we're going to have is the conflicts that gave rise to Chavez reemerge. So that's partly what's on the table with Maria Corina Machado. And unfortunately, her statements over the last 2 months since winning the Nobel Peace Prize have left a lot to be desired in terms of her prospects for creating a just and lasting peace.
That's really interesting. Can we focus also a little bit on the people of Venezuela who are caught in the middle of the crisis, who are caught in the middle of these escalating tensions between the United States and the Venezuelan government? There's been a massive exodus from Venezuela in recent years, more than 8 million people who have left the country amid the severe political, economic, and social crisis. In light of these rising tensions, what do you think this new phase will mean for those who remain in Venezuela as well as those who have left?
Venezuelans are an extremely resilient people. One of the things, as a Venezuelan myself, that has been, I would say, a kind of silver lining of hope over these last 25 years of tremendously polarized politics of ebbs and flows between boom times and bust times, between heightened political tensions and moments of seeming calm, is that for as polarized as Venezuelan society is, we've not in the last 25 years descended into all-out political conflict or civil war, as has happened in many other countries in Latin America and, in fact, the world, with similar levels of polarization, inequality, and such. That suggests to me that Venezuelans, deep down, most of them do not actually want a lingering conflict. Really what they most seek is stability in their lives, some possibility of, handing to their children, something better than they've received. And what that shows in this particular moment of heightened tensions is that ultimately life goes on. People are not bunkering down or hunkering down. They are, going about their lives. They are, working. They are going to baseball games. They are shopping. And so, there's lots that would suggest, if you just see on the surface, that they're living in a state of denial. But they're not living in a state of denial. What they're living in is a state of understanding that these moments have come and gone in the past. Yes, of course, if bombs begin to drop, that will significantly alter the equation. But until they do, there's little else to do other than to go about your lives as much as possible. There's something like gallows humor, I think, is one way to put it, especially, given the last 25 years. And so I speak with my family, and they throw jokes about whether or not today's going to be the day that they're going to have to go, into the bunker. They have no bunker. Or whether, the Marines roll in if they're going to have a good time at the beach and then forget about their mission. So to the extent that might be a way to deflect against the anxiety that obviously having this, tension. But the subtext is, as you note, and in every conversation I have, the subtext is this the time when everything will fall apart? We've been through deep crisis before, but nothing like what an armed intervention would bring. So, a lot of it is balancing out, a sense not of carefreeness, but rather of survival and trying to find ways of coping. I suppose that would be a better way to think about it, while at the same time harboring this deep sense of mounting anxiety. For many Venezuelans, my friends and family included, it's tomorrow is another day. And the day after that is another day. You cannot plan anything beyond what happens tomorrow. And so that's a very difficult place to be in, where the future seems so uncertain. And the hope of another day is the only thing really that you have going for you.
Wow. Alejandro Velasco, thank you so much for joining us today on The Take.
Thank you. I really appreciated the conversation.